I was asked to talk about management, governance and democracy. At least that's what I've told myself I'm talking about, which I'm very keen to do because of my intense loathing of managerialism. I'm not going to sort of become Des Freeman and talk about those other issues, but we can bring them into the discussion afterwards. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about how managerialism has developed, in my view, and then I'll put forward an alternative view of what we could try and aim for, which isn't mine, but came from a member of UCU, in which I'm an activist, who sent it around, and I think it's got some really good ideas in it. But I just wanted to start by prefacing it with a couple of sort of autobiographical remarks. The first is that I'm one of the oldest people in the room, I think. There are only a couple of others who go back as far as me. I am, unlike Thomas Doherty, a 68, and great days it was. But also I can remember the universities when they weren't like what they are now, as I've been around universities all my adult life. I can remember when there was no ref, when there was no QAA, when, and this is the most important bit of all, I think, when there were no devolved budgets, and when the universities were run by a small group of people. You didn't have much to do with them, but they were quite benign, I think, in a sort of old-fashioned liberal way. They were quite patriarchal, of course, and we should beware of golden ageism. It wasn't a golden age, and certainly there has been quite an egalitarian move within universities, though it's now under threat, I believe, since then. But having said that, it meant that the universities did conform more to the Newman model set out in his brilliant idea of a university, that the university should represent the whole range of knowledge, so that arts subjects and social science subjects were funded along with STEM subjects without any of this stuff about we're cross-subsidising you and you're stealing our money and all the stuff that goes on now. So that's me. The other autobiographical point that I want to make is that I have in fact been a manager. I was a dean of faculty for 3 years, and why I'm telling you that is that I don't believe that you have to be managerialist if you're a manager. In fact, what I would like to think of is that people like the deans and the vice-chancellors should not be managers, but should be leaders. We should return to a leadership rather than a management model. And although I'm sure I made mistakes as a manager and did some bad things, I did try to take into it the principles of unionism and feminism and to manage in a feminist way. It didn't go down well with the Vice-Chancellor and the other deans, which is why I've not become a PVC or a Vice-Chancellor. Okay, so let me start. One of the first things that happened when I moved to Bristol University from Sunderland, where I worked for a long time, and went to the first JNC meeting as a union rep, was that the Deputy Vice-Chancellor said, and he said it in these very words, "This is not a university, it is 45 small businesses." And this, of course, was the direct result of devolved budgets. That was how Bristol University was being run, and the devolved budgets had put all the different departments into competition with each other. So we were moving away from being colleagues to be competitors. And that I take from my own perspective. Others would start it elsewhere, but to me, the coming of the internal market, which of course was Thatcher's great move for the public sector of the internal market, and devolved budgets, was the sort of beginning of the rot that has subsequently taken over the universities. And that neoliberal approach, which was pioneered by Thatcher and her minions, the ghastly Keith Joseph among them, has brought in, since then, since those days, this long, slow progress of commercialisation, marketisation, leading eventually, as we fear, to privatisation, and above all, the primacy of money. And I think that is the thing that we have all deplored in recent years. Also, of course, the imposition of new public management techniques, as it's known in the industrial relations literature, which was based on the ridiculous idea that somehow people couldn't manage in the public sector and they needed to take on the principles of the private sector, which already was struggling and running into deficit. Now, what I think about this process was that it happened incrementally, so we were taken unawares. Little by little, it sort of crept up upon us until we find ourselves in the position we're in today. And it has, of course, stepped up recently, but it wasn't a time of bliss during the government of New Labour. Obviously, the coming of the coalition has screwed everything up. So where we are now, in my view, is that the managerialism which has been creeping on us has now taken this very increasingly crude and brutal form, which involves particularly a layer of middle managers who manage by micromanagement, by bullying, by aggressive performance management, and the development of bureaucratic rules which are not safeguarding, as sometimes the union hoped they would be, but restrictive and repressive and inhibiting of flexibility. A very good example of that distortion of bureaucratic intent is what has happened to the equal opportunities policies at Bristol, which obviously were developed originally to try and get more black people and women employed. But now they've just meant that every job has to be advertised to everybody, and therefore it will always go to a white male. You know, so it does exactly the opposite of what it was intended to do. And I think a lot of the bureaucratic procedures in universities have taken that turn. So why has this happened? I think we have to start with the Vice-Chancellors. I see that Martin is not here anymore. Obviously he's an exception, but I'm afraid the rest of them are not very like him. These kind of systems have been, if not developed, at least facilitated and encouraged by the Vice-Chancellors and their senior management teams. And I think one of the reasons was what was talked about in the last plenary session, which was the view that somehow academics were not really fit to manage. And therefore, what happened was not so much that loads of people from outside were brought in, although that has happened in some institutions, but it hasn't happened, for example, at Bath, at UWE, or at Bristol, at the free universities that sort of are in my area. They are all of them currently headed by academics. But because those academics are sort of posited as being only academics, not managers, in my view, they've come increasingly to rely upon the finance directors, the registrars and the bursars, almost all of whom are not academics. That has certainly happened at Bristol. Eric Thomas, who, as you know, is the principal of UUK and will therefore become Sir Eric Thomas at the end of his term, like Sir Steve Smith, simply has given up on doing anything managerial. He doesn't even always head Senate anymore, which he always promised us when he arrived he would do. He doesn't sit, as he always promised us he would do, on professorial appointments. He's handed it all over to other people, and the finance director has driven all the structural return, and some other people who I won't mention by name have sort of taken over the academic stuff and not done it very well. Now, so those people, the power of the finance directors and others, because they come from the private sector, meant that they brought in these kind of policies because that was what they were used to. I mean, our current finance director used to run Anglian Water. And when he arrived in a university which, you know, he knew nothing about the HE sector, he immediately developed a centralising support service plan which was based on what he's done at Anglian Water. You won't be surprised to hear it hasn't worked very well. What then has happened, a sort of second tier of this, and the thing that I find most worrying, because in a way you might expect that to have happened given the political climate and neoliberalism and capitalism's encroachment into the sector, is that this has now been transmitted to a layer of middle managers, the deans, the PVCs, the heads of school even. And this is what I have found so profoundly depressing, that I have seen colleagues appointed to these positions who were good colleagues, good fellows, and who've turned into these little Hitler monsters. And I'm not exaggerating, the bullying that goes on in these departments is horrendous. I mean, some of them are trying to introduce timesheets, and as I've explained to other colleagues, we've now got a policy at Bristol where everyone has to be available to teach from 9 to 5, 6 days a week. That includes Saturdays. Of course, you don't have to teach all that time, but you have to be available to teach, which means, you know, that women with children might be called in to come into open days because they're all held on Saturdays. And if you have an abusive manager, some of them are, they then say, well, you've got to be in your room from 9 to 5 every day for 5 days a week. So that's the kind of thing that's happening. I can't quite understand why this happened. I'd be very interesting if you can tell me, but it does seem to be that the moment they sort of take up these offices, they take on the discourse of economic necessity and go along with it and don't challenge it. It may be different in your institutions, and as if it is, I'd be pleased to hear about it. The other growth, of course, is the growth of the accompanying tier of support services management, and particularly what Laurie Taylor always calls our ever-increasing HR department. And you probably know that the only two occupations in the university sector which have increased over the last 10 years are managers and HR and student support professionals. So you've got a massive number of people coming in. It may be different again in your institutions, but our HR staff are not members of the trade union. And they have become a group of apparatchiks who administer these extraordinarily arcane, complex and tedious bureaucratic systems, which are all then sort of pushed down to us academics to fill in the various bits of paper that they insist on us filling in. And I've seen how that happened in the time that I've been there, that the whole sort of relation of the union to management has changed as a result. When I first came, and I said that this awful statement was made by the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, but at least at that time we met with the Vice-Chancellor, the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, one other PVC, who was usually the research PVC, and the HR director, who had he was very low in the pecking order. Now we meet with the HR director and 2 or 3 of his staff. We never meet with the Vice-Chancellor. He's refused to meet us. We demanded to have a member of the academic leadership come, so they appointed one of the PVCs to be a representative on the JNC, but he hardly ever turns up. So basically, we now negotiate with the Human Resources Director, and he therefore de facto becomes a spokesperson for management. So the function of HR, which is supposed to be to sort of, you know, keep good employment relations going and look after the interests of all staff, they have just become a tool of management. And that's made our job as a union extremely difficult, I can tell you. Yeah, okay, how many minutes have I got? 1. Oh, God, can I have 2? I'm nearly at the end. Okay, so concomitantly to that, and it's important to say this, I've really just got 2 things to say. Going on with that has been the erosion of democracy, which has been talked about before, but it's just worth pointing out how it's happened, and I'm sure this is the same everywhere. Deans at Bristol are now appointed, not elected. I was the last elected dean at Bristol. They're appointed by the SMT. The Senate has been reduced in size. Very few of the members of the Senate are not heads of school or head of department. The council is reduced in size. There are fewer academic reps. Faculty boards have been replaced by various committees, the strategy faculty committee, etc., and basically white males continue to dominate. Consultation occurs in a sort of top-down way. It's really a sham. There's no real democratic participation, and junior staff feel completely disempowered. So that's what's happened, and I think it's happened everywhere else, really. So the final point I want to make is the need to restore democratic structures and reinvent collegialism. But one thing that I would say, and I'm just going to sort of read you out now this letter from a member, but I would say that a message that's come through to me very strongly from this convention is difference and diversity. Universities are not all the same, and it may be that, you know, different structures are appropriate for different institutions. That's something we have to think about. But this is the letter from the, I'll close with this letter. So this person is recommending a national campaign for democratic academic governance to apply throughout the UK further and higher education sector. This entails campaigning for the institutionalisation of regular and open elections to most senior administrative positions in universities and colleges, including heads of unit, heads of school, deans, provosts, membership of executive committees, including deputy VCs and VCs ideally, membership of remuneration committee, research committee and other key bodies. You can see some similarities with what Terry told us about in the Grudzinski report, but it takes it further. And the electoral voting body would consist of all academic and support staff on a one-person, one-vote representation by the student body. Could be introduced by a format. And I like the idea that's been put forward by my colleague from Bath about broadcasting Senate and Council on PA systems. I think that would be very good. So the letter concluded, my 25 years of experience in the UK HE sector as a member of academic staff leads me to the conclusion that such reform is absolutely necessary, and it will constitute perhaps the best means of reversing the destructive trends now raging through the sector, give our members and all staff renewed confidence and hope for the future of education in this country. And I do believe that, you know, such a democratic move is really important to fight for, and it might restore hope in what seems like a hopeless situation. Sorry I went on a bit, Tom. That's it.